So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged, technically speaking, and to another tier list because it was received reasonably well. So it will be a series that I will just be sort of slowly continuing over time as an accompaniment to the rest of the videos that I release. And today, sort of taking a departure from the Elven faction we just looked at, I'm going to be taking a look at one of the Western Kingdoms of Men, starting off with one of the most recognisable of such, which is going to be Gondor, of course. Gondor, a faction I have a bit of a soft spot for, to be honest with you, considering the fact that way back in vanilla, Third Age, when that was still the dominant force, Gondor were probably my favourite faction, to be honest with you. They weren't the strongest faction. They were good, but they weren't sort of on the same sort of level as the Elves, Dwarves or Arnor at the time. But I just liked the way they went about their business. I liked their style. Things have changed pretty significantly since then, though, while they have a very strong infantry core now, in fact, especially when it comes to being a little bit more defensive and absorbing pressure. The same can certainly be said of their archers as well, which is a good strength of their faction. They do lack a little bit in terms of some of their more aggressive options, perhaps. Also, they have a little bit of a weakness against AP-heavy factions, because very few of the Gondorian units aren't reliant on their armour. And, of course, their cavalry lineup, since Dol Amroth split off to become their own faction, has been a little bit lacking in terms of both quality and the options that you have there in terms of sheer numbers. But that will become apparent as we get into the main meat of this list. So Gondor have got a few more options in terms of their roster size than the Elves. Gondor have got one of the larger rosters overall in the game, and that has always been the case, interestingly enough, as well. So we'll start off with a unit they actually share with several other factions, which is the Civilians. Now, the Civilians, kind of an interesting unit, I would say. I think that the Civilians, when you consider their usefulness to other factions, I think it's slightly less in Gondor, because I think with Gondor you're rarely going to be wanting to skimp on your front line in terms of spending, because that's where Gondor can really lay down a bit of an advantage over many other factions. Like there are factions in the game that of course can outmuscle Gondor on the front line, but even in those matchups Gondor are going to want to go fairly heavy on that fight, because a lot of their other options might not be up to the task, like their cavalry flanking, which, for example, for Dol Amroth, if you want to bring a lot of your heavy cavalry units, you'll probably have to save a bit of money somewhere, which is probably going to be your Civilians, to be fair. Okay, yeah, just making sure of that. But yeah, the Civilians, I would suggest, probably D tier. I think that many people will say that the Civilians, for what they offer for such a low cost, should be a little bit higher. For other factions, I would agree. I think when we get on to the likes of Rohan and Dol Amroth, you'll see the Civilians climb up into C tier. But considering that I'm taking the unit as a whole, having a look at how it fits into the faction and how useful they can be to this particular faction, I'm putting them into D, because I think Gondor have got so many other options that you need to have on the front line in order to sort of play to the faction's strengths. And it's not even as if Gondor have got nothing that they can do with a small amount of money like the Civilians cost, because armour upgrades are a real factor with Gondor, and you really want to be spending your additional leftover funds on those rather than just getting a unit of shovel and pickaxe wielding Civilians, in my opinion. Speaking of which, another reason why I don't think you'd want them is the Gondor Militia Infantry. Now, the Militia Infantry do have the obvious downside of not having a spear like some of the other Western militia units, which obviously allows you to have a cheap but rather effective cavalry screen. The thing is, though, Gondor have got so many other options that can do this. Like Gondor's spear and sort of long spear, two-handed spear line is so broad and really effective as well. There's some real gems in that lineup that you don't necessarily need a militia spearman, I would suggest, as Gondor, which does mean having a cheap militia swordsman like this for the front line just to really pad out those numbers you have can actually be quite a useful thing. Now, I'd say that they're not as useful as something like the Eastron Clansman from Rune, because it plays into Rune's strengths a little bit more to have those numbers, but they're still a good unit. And I would say that they have a shield, slightly more numbers even than the Civilians. They're nothing too special, but I would still rate them at C tier, especially like if you need to attack in a siege and you need some additional numbers to go with some of your quality. I feel as though it's definitely not the worst way you can go. Then, however, we move in to the real bread and butter of any Gondorian army, starting off with the Gondorian Spearmen. Now, the Spearmen, of course, you can upgrade their armour to make them very tanky. Damage-wise, as with most of the standard Western Spearmen, they're not going to be really good against infantry. Like, they're going to do their damage very slowly. The advantage I think the Gondorian Spearmen have over quite a few of their peers is the fact that you can upgrade their armour for a relatively small amount of money, and this makes them very, very resilient, especially in formation. It's going to be quite tricky for you to wear down Gondor Spearmen unless you have the armour-piercing units that you need to do this. Also, the fact that they have the utility as a cavalry screen as well. I couldn't put them into A tier, for example, because they just don't have the show-stopping ability or the really high value that a cheaper unit would need to get into A tier. It's not true, I think, of the Gondor Spears, because they do cost 575 at the base, which is not overly expensive, but it's not overly cheap either, considering what the unit offers. But I think it really does sum up what Gondor are all about, really, in a single unit, more so than most. And I think a B tier offering for the Gondor Spearmen is very fair, because it is a very nice glue to hold your formations together. Similar could be said of the Gondor Infantry as well. They are actually cheaper at 500. Having said that, they don't have the anti-cavalry potential as the Gondor Spears do. Neither do they have the shield wall formation. Gondor Infantry are in a bit of an awkward spot. I mean, I was even briefly considering putting them into C tier, to be honest with you, because they never really perform out of their skin, as it were. Like, their killing potential on the front line is actually relatively low, even for a unit of men-at-arms like this. But when I actually thought about it, most of the Western Kingdoms sword and board units are kind of like that. It's only when you start to get into some of the more expensive units, like the Númenórean Cohort, or even something like the Alcarondas Legion, where you're talking about really higher quality troops overall. So it's not really fair to compare the Gondor Infantry to that. I still couldn't put them into something like A tier for the same reason as the Spears. Like, they actually offer probably better value than the Spears because they are cheaper, even before the armour upgrades. But I would say that B tier is probably fair for them. Like, they will never really win you the game, but they will offer your front line that little bit of extra rigidity. They will need supporting units around them, and this is true for the infantry and the spears. Like, their damage is relatively low. Like, they can definitely take a beating when you upgrade them fully, but you're definitely going to need some of Gondor's supporting units around them, whether it be archers or some of their higher tier infantry, to get the most out of a unit like this. But that is what Gondor specialise in, and the spears and the swords don't do anything too wrong in that regard. Speaking of which, Axemen of Lasarnak, another interesting unit that Gondor have at their disposal, another unit that you really get the most out of when you upgrade its armour fully. It's something that most other human axemen like this do not have the ability to do. Most other human axemen tend to have relatively low armour values and not very good melee skill either, so while they're all capable of dishing out that big AP damage with those axes, very often they will fizzle out pretty quickly, unless you have like really good support around them. But in that case, you're probably not taking advantage of the gap you've seen, and the enemy will probably be ready for that advance anyway. The Axemen of Lasarnak are a little bit different, however, in the sense that that armour, they still don't have the best melee defense values, but no heavy axemen really will, unless you get into like bodyguard tier units, or maybe the Elven offerings, for example, from Lothlorien. But that armour really does make a big difference. It makes them significantly tankier than something like the Riddermark Axemen, for example, from their neighbours from the north. They have less men in the unit, but the individual survivability, especially when you put them alongside something like the Spears and the Swordsmen, can be really, really useful. And honestly, I was thinking about putting them into B tier as well, but when I really started to think about it, the usefulness they offer to Gondor, who have got a mostly sort of spear-orientated, more defensive lineup, I have to put them into A tier, I think. I think that for the cost, the damage that they can do, I've seen them break like 300 kills in the past when they're properly supported. For a unit that costs that much, you know, for a unit that, you know, overcomes the main weakness to a certain extent that most other Western heavy axemen have, I think I have to put the Axemen of Lasarnak into A. You know, the value they offer, the AP damage, really useful alongside the certainly the more defensive mainline units we've already seen. Then, Guards of Osgiliath. Now, Guards of Osgiliath sort of returning really to the spear pike sort of thing that Gondor have going on. They are the only pikes that Gondor have, to be fair, or at least, you know, pike weapon class that Gondor have. And they're another interesting unit because they're not on the lower end of the spectrum where you have sort of a cheap pike that you can blanket the line with, something like Cardlan or Rudour, but neither are they on the same level as the pikes from someone like Imladris or Khazad-dûm, for example, who spend a lot on a single unit of pikes, but the quality is really very, very high. I think for those reasons, the Guards of Osgiliath are a really strong unit on the front line, I would say. You know, they can definitely hold in the same way that many pikes can, but due to their slightly higher cost and the fact that you can't blanket the line with them as you could with something like the Uruk-hai pikemen, for example, I'm not going to put them down into C tier because I think that does disrespect how well they do, but I think B tier is quite fair for the Guards of Osgiliath because they're really just rather bog standard for the price that they are, and yeah, they don't do anything too special, but they do their job very well, which I think puts them alongside stuff like the infantry and the spearmen. Then we start to get into the real meat and bones of what Gondor are all about. The Citadel Guard are a real personal favourite of mine, I would suggest, because again they have that really nice shield and armour value which Gondor are known for, giving them a lot of survivability, very tanky. Obviously they have that AP as well in melee, which makes them a really good all-rounder. It makes them able to take on line infantry of a similar tier to themselves. The thing I think that holds them back, I will say now, from getting S tier is the fact that they are very expensive, which means that the units that they are technically able to defeat in terms of line infantry are cheaper than them. So that is worth bearing in mind. Like, the value is still there, but it's maybe not quite as good as it first appears. And I would also say that when you're looking at all of these higher end Gondor options, you might have to make a decision between bringing one unit or the other. And I would say that if push came to shove, there are a couple of units in the Gondorian infantry line that I would bring ahead of the Citadel Guard if I had to, which I think is key in making the decision between which units are worthy of S tier and which ones are maybe not. Citadel Guard, though, if I could give them an A+, I would, because they are a really fantastic unit. Very good all-rounders. And really, I would suggest, though, the only thing they have over the unit that I would put in S tier ahead of them is the shield, which is a big deal, but I think Gondor have got plenty of other shields that they can use to supplement the unit that I will ultimately putting into S tier. And speaking of which, the Fountain Guard. Now, the Fountain Guard, once upon a time, Gondor, I would say, were very reliant on the Fountain Guard to be competitive at all. That's not the case anymore. I think Gondor can actually get away with not bringing the Fountain Guard now and still be competitive. Having said that, I think the Fountain Guard is still such a useful tool on the front line. Like, they can be the anchor that the Guards of Osgiliath can be. Also, they can be a lot more aggressive. Like, they're technically two-handed spears, but they can behave more like halberdiers. Like, that's how I usually think of them, really. And the Fountain Guard is just such a good unit to hold your army together with. Like, whether you're in a siege on the attack or the defence, whether you're on an open field, like the Fountain Guard, even though Gondor are not as reliant on them as they once were, I would still say that it's rare that you see Gondor not bring the Fountain Guard, and there's the reason for that. Obviously, AP, huge damage. Cavalry gets absolutely destroyed by them if they get caught in them. You know, really good against enemy infantry as well. Yes, they're expensive, but they're worth every penny. And for me, that's why the Fountain Guard deserve S tier, because they are just the heart and soul of a lot of Gondorian army players' picks. Speaking of which, we have what is technically the shielded Fountain Guard, the Nimlothian Honour Guard. So this is the first bodyguard tier unit we're looking at for Gondor. Really, the difference with them is they are multiple HP. They also have that massive shield. Obviously, you can only have one before the cost increases. They're very expensive as well. But for me, this is another choice that I have to put into S tier. You know, I think that when it comes to spear bodyguards, there aren't many that I would consider to be like really worth the price. You know, the Gwythi Arthand, I would say, come close to reasonably close to S tier because of how tanky they really are. The difference maker here, though, of course, with the Nimlothians is the fact that they have AP, which means they're capable of dishing out the damage as well as being that stalwart in the middle of the line. And for me, again, like, if you're putting the Fountain Guard into S tier, you have to put the Nimlothian Honour Guard in there as well. It is what Gondor are all about, so you'd expect this to be where they pick up some of their higher ratings, and for me that is absolutely the case. Now, we move on to another two-hander unit, and that is the Ravenhelms of Caer Andros. So Swordmaster units in general had a cost reduction and a slight statistical buff as well in the recent patch, which is good, because units like this pretty much universally would have been lower down on lists, I think, if we did it on the last patch. For example, we saw the Broynin River Wards and Elder Runway Swordmasters from Imladris get into B tier. In the last patch, I think, especially the Broynin River Wards probably would have only made it to C, because they were so easy to counter, so expensive. Similar story really with the Ravenhelms of Caer Andros, only from a human perspective. And very nice armour on the Ravenhelm, sort of similar to the Axemen of Lasarnak. They have the extra armour. The difference is, I think Swordmasters do actually benefit a little bit more from more melee defence than armour, generally speaking, because that is ultimately their main focus. I would say that last patch, much like the Elven Swordmasters, I would have put them into C tier because the value proposition wasn't really there most of the time, but they were still good enough in prolonged melee that they weren't on like D tier, I don't think. But I think B is probably fair for them. Like, they're still fairly expensive. But yeah, I mean, I think B is fair. Like, I wouldn't put them on the same level as like the Militia Swordsmen in terms of the value that they can offer. You do need to be careful with them, which is why I would say B tier. There is also the case that I think Gondor have got so many other higher tier options that the Ravenhelms still are probably going to be left behind more often than not. But they're still a good unit. Like, they are useful now. Then we come on to a unit I've been struggling about, the Wardens of the White Tower. Now, my issue with the Wardens of the White Tower is they're a bodyguard unit, which is fair enough. You know, they obviously are going to be very dominant in a melee fight in a vacuum against most other things they come into contact with, especially when you put them in and amongst the rest of the hardened steel Gondor front line. However, the Wardens of the White Tower, I could never really justify bringing them over the Nimlothian Honor Guard. The Nimlothian Honor Guard, generally speaking, are going to be tankier, bigger shield, obviously, anti-cavalry bonus, more men in the unit, all of that good stuff. So, you know, definitely not, like, it's no contest between the two, in my opinion. Nimlothian Honor Guard, in any kind of battle, I would sort of recommend them over the Wardens, to be honest. And then there's also the fact that when you compare the Wardens of the White Tower to other factions, other similar factions, like this is the sort of unit that you would expect Gondor to be good with, like heavily armoured, sword and board, but they've been left behind by a lot of other factions in that regard. Obviously the dwarves, but you kind of expect that, but also other units, stuff like the Royal Legion of Armenelos. You know, they have a higher man count by about 20 over the Wardens of the White Tower, which is massive. It makes a huge difference, and considering they cost about the same, for me, in relation to where the game is at the moment, the value proposition just isn't there for the Wardens of the White Tower. They still have their uses, but I wouldn't put them any higher than C, honestly. Like, and again, this is not a tier list on the quality of the individual units. Like, that is very easy to do. Like, militia, mainline, upper mid, bodyguard. Like, that's easy to do. But for me, when you're talking about the overall effectiveness, Wardens of the White Tower, not for me. You know, they if they're going to be made sort of more useful, they've got a long way to go, I think. But I mean, are they ever going to be as useful as the Nimlothian Honor Guard anyway? I don't know. We'll have to see. Now, though, we move on to the archer line. Gondor have got a much more varied archer line than Imladris have, certainly. We start off with the Gondor Militia Archers, which I think there was once upon a time in the game's meta where cheap archers were the way to go. They can still be used in the same way, and I think the Gondor Militia Archers, more so than most other sort of cheap human militia archers, still maintain that niche. I think that Arthedain and Cardland still have a bit of an advantage there because it's something they're more encouraged to go into. But the Gondor Militia Archers, decent armour for an archer on this level. They actually have a slight shield value as well, so that's something. So I think for those reasons, I think I'll give them C, because I think with Gondor, like they're just functional. Like C is average, I would say. Like not like terrible, but not really that great either. And I think that's where they fit in, because I think Gondor, if you're going to go in for your skirmish line, you're going to go for the higher end options. Speaking of which, Gondor archers, they don't have the shield value, but they do slightly more damage, and also they're able to upgrade their armour as well, which overall will improve their tankiness to beyond what the basic militia will be able to endure. And I think for that, you've got to put them into C. I think, or B, I should say. Like, they are something which many factions will struggle to deal with in numbers, especially alongside some of Gondor's heavier archers. And I think Gondor can outmuscle people in a skirmish fight by using units like this more often than they can't. Like, against factions like Dale and Umbar, it becomes a little bit more questionable. But I think B is a fair place to put the Gondorian archers. Pelargir Marines, the one javelin unit that Gondor have in their roster. Now, javelins are a bit weird. Again, in much the same way as I talked about the Guards of Osgiliath, the Pelargir Marines sort of exist in the middle. They aren't a cheap javelin, like the Orc Javelins or Snaga Skirmishers, who don't necessarily do a huge amount of damage, but they're so cheap that the damage that they do is often very worthwhile, and they'll always draw ranged fire as well, but you don't really mind because they're so cheap. Then you have the higher end javelins, stuff like the Ferodrim, javelins from Rudau, the Medicel Guard, and especially stuff like Demons of the Desert. Those are the javelins which, you know, one volley, two volleys, you're going to be able to do tons and tons of damage to the enemy army. Pelargir Marines really operate in the spot in between. And I think I've never really seen a unit like the Pelargir Marines perform amazingly well. I think I have to put them into C, to be honest with you. I was toying with the idea of putting them into B, because javelins overall can be so useful. But I feel as though the utility that Gondor's archers offer them, like if you had to pick between having lackluster javelins or an sort of extra solidified skirmish line, what would you go with as Gondor? And I think you'd have to go with the extra solidified skirmishers. Because not only that, Gondor's higher tier skirmishers will also perform much better than the Pelargir Marines in melee, which I think is fairly key. It might be a bit harsh to put them down here. Maybe B is the right call, but I'm going to leave them in C, to be honest. Athelian Rangers. Now, Rangers, Imladris, of course, didn't have Rangers, so we couldn't really talk about that topic there, but we can here. I think it's worth saying now that with Rangers, they have the highest kill potential of any kind of unit in the game, by a long way, in fact. Like, you can see Rangers get over 1,000 kills in a siege, and you wouldn't really be that surprised. Having said that, Rangers, sort of, that is their ideal sort of environment in a choke point, you know, getting shots right along the line. If you can do that with Rangers, brilliant. Like, they're going to be able to sort of get you your kills easily. Open field, however, across many different types of battles, it becomes a little less clear how you should rate Rangers. I think for the killing potential, I will say right here and now that the baseline for Rangers is going to be A tier, and that's where I'm going to be putting the Athelian Rangers as well. Having said that, there are going to be a couple of Rangers as we go through these tier lists which do poke their heads into S tier. The Athelian Rangers aren't one of them though, because they're just sort of a basic ranger unit that will do the body piercing damage. Yes, they have the highest killing potential of any Gondorian unit, as any Rangers will, but across the whole spectrum, like, I think for standardization purposes, if you're a Ranger, it's a fairly safe bet you're going to get into A tier. A couple of them will get into S, and we'll talk about why when they arrive eventually. But for here, Athelian Rangers, fantastic in a siege. Defensively, obviously, they're going to be decent as well, which is Gondor's strength. However, the more open the map is, the more spread out the enemies are, Rangers can be countered a little bit more easily, and of course, a little bit weak in a skirmish fight. Marksman of Caer Andros, a personal favourite of mine as well. Pretty much the big brother to the Gondorian archers. Better armour, obviously better damage at range, and also significantly stronger in melee because they pull out that two-handed sword, which makes a big difference. And it's one of the reasons why they're going straight into A tier. Like, I couldn't put them into S because they're not dominant at range or in melee, but they're good enough there that, you know, any old garbage that goes up against them in either of those two sort of arenas, as it were, is going to lose. And it's something which makes Gondor really multifaceted, because the fact that their archers are really just as capable of dishing out damage as their main line means that you have to be a little bit more careful with how you choose to try and shut their skirmishers down. Veterans of Osgiliath. Now, Veterans of Osgiliath are an interesting one. They're very expensive, and they're a defensive archer. Now, one of the things I've been considering with the veterans is, how do I rate them? Like, I think that the value proposition they have actually is kind of difficult to justify. I think if you're going to go for like the full, expecting the full skirmish war, you have to go with them because they're the heaviest archer you have. Shield value, really heavy armour when you upgrade it. Decent in melee as well as a line infantry unit. But for me, the value proposition is better on the Marksman of Caer Andros, coupled with the fact you can only have one of the Veterans of Osgiliath. Really what I'm doing here is I'm talking into giving them a B ranking, and I think that's fair. I think for the cost, I couldn't really put them higher. They're still a very good unit, of course, and if you're in like a more defensive setting like a siege, like, you're probably going to bring them, because when all's said and done, they do decent damage at range, and then they can also muck in melee when they pull out their swords and shields. But I couldn't really put them up any higher than this, because I don't think they're going to get any more value than the Marksman. I think the Marksmen are going to get more value than they are. And that's just my overall thoughts there. Still a very good unit, but very high cost for a unit that's ultimately quite defensive. Like, if you're paying that much for a unit, you want them to have more bite than they do. And that would be my key there. The final archer unit, the Wardens of Minas Ithil. I think in the last patch I would have been very tempted to give them like C or even D, to be honest with you. Yes, they were a ranger, but they had all the same weaknesses as a regular ranger. They didn't do as much damage as well either, because they were a smaller unit. Kind of a weird place, but now they're an armor-piercing archer. A little bit different to stuff like the Blackshot Dragon Slayers or the Temple Guard from Mordor, in the sense that they are squishier, you know, not quite as strong in melee, but they can hide anywhere. They still have all of those rangery type traits that you would expect, albeit instead of body piercing they have armor piercing arrows. I think for those reasons, I think one of the main things that sets those armor piercing archers from the other factions apart, like stuff like the Blackshots, as I've said, is the fact that they are a really tough unit as well. Like, you can use them in the late game as sort of like an infantry unit that could potentially win you the game. It's less the case, I think, with the Wardens of Minas Ithil. Wardens of Minas Ithil, I should say. Armor piercing arrows, though. Armor piercing arrows. That is such a good thing, especially in conjunction with a lot of other Gondor's archers, and most of them are sort of more grind focused other than the rangers themselves. it's difficult, this one. It really is, because I think that once they start shooting, they will be more easily focused down. But yeah, I think I've got to go A tier. I think armor-piercing arrows, like, they are as good as you make them. Like, it is. This comes with the caveat that you have to use them effectively. Like, it's one of those things that's so easily wasted on trash. And in that case, like, they're B tier. But I think in the hands of the right players, like, I think armor-piercing arrows can be such a good tool, especially for, like, sniping out enemy knights, which otherwise Gondor could have a problem with. I think that is the key, I think. Like, Gondor against, like, really devastating cavalry units, to have the ability to snipe some of them out with a unit like this, I think is quite important. Speaking of cavalry, this is probably where Gondor are going to lose a few points, because Gondor's cavalry is... it's not terrible, but it's not particularly good either. Like, Gondor's cavalry, it doesn't have any real stinkers in it, like the Noritano cavalry, I would suggest, but neither does it have what the rest of the Imladris cavalry line is, which is really fantastic. Starting off with the Gondor cavalry, yes, you can upgrade their armour twice in the same way as all the other standard Gondorian units, but the value proposition for these guys really isn't there. They're a spear cavalry unit, which you would expect to do decently well against other cav, but I've never really seen them do all that well. Like, really the only reason you'd bring them is as an accompaniment to the highest tier of Gondor cavalry, but even in that capacity, both when I've used them myself and when I've seen other people use them, I'd go D. Like, they're just disappointing for what they are, to be honest with you. I can understand why they don't have a shield, and I can understand as well why the Gondor cavalry is not capable of just massacring enemy cavalry units as well, because if they could, it would make Gondor pretty much cavalry proof, which would be a problem. So yeah, I think D is fair for the Gondor cavalry. The Peneth Gaeling cavalry, who actually are a decent unit of sort of mid-tier lancers. The difference is, like, where most factions sort of will be able to use their mid-tier lancers in conjunction with some other units of cavalry. For the Gondorians, they are a little bit isolated, I would suggest. And I would say, I mean, lancers like this, your mileage will definitely vary, because any lancers could potentially do good damage if you get good charges off. The problem here is, though, enemy cavalry forces are going to be able to hunt down the more limited Gondorian cav a little bit more easily, I think, if they're paying attention. And just generally speaking, it's going to be more difficult to use them. Like, they're not bad, but neither would I say they are amazing either. I think they are fairly expensive as well. You can upgrade the armour. Obviously, that will incur even more cost into them. I think C. I mean, you could make the argument for B on the Peneth Gaeling cavalry, to be honest with you. But I think C is fair for them. Like, it's just because most other factions are going to be able to deal with the Gondorian cavalry force unless you go really heavily into it, which is unexpected, but it will also take away from your ability to use some of Gondor's really nasty tools that we've already talked about. And finally, the Mithrandir's retinue bodyguard. Now, this is another good example of a unit that on its own is actually really, really good. Like, I actually really do rate Mithrandir's retinue bodyguard quite highly as an individual. I think among the multiple HP lancers in the game, I could even call it, I would even stick my neck out and say it's possibly the best one. You know, combination of shield, armour and really nice cost as well, in comparison to some of the others, makes it the tankiest and also capable of dishing out very high amounts of damage. Problem is, though, it's a multiple HP lancer, like I said. It's not a knight unit, which means if you charge it into another high tier unit of cavalry, most of them are going to be able to deal with the Mithrandir's bodyguard. So that is an issue, and it's another issue behind the Gondorian cavalry force in general. Like, there are other cav forces which specialise in not engaging horseback-to-horseback fighting. And there's Harad and Cardland come immediately to mind, but they are very fast cavalry forces, and they have other things going on which kind of make it better for them than Gondor. They are such a good unit, though, Mithrandir's retinue bodyguard. Like, especially if you combine them in a team battle with another player's cavalry force, like as a sort of hard centre. They can be really good, but I don't know, man. I think I'm putting them into B. I think I've talked myself into putting them into B just because as an individual unit they would be higher, I think. But when you fit them into the rest of the Gondorian roster, it is hard for them. Like, the Gondorian cavalry can perform well, but it's a struggle to make it do so, and you're also taking away from some of the other strengths you have, which would be why I would just rate the Mithrandir's bodyguard as overall just above average rather than like good or excellent. And so there we go. We come to the end of the Gondorians, and in fact we can see rather surprisingly actually, there's almost a perfect bell curve going on here, from S to D tier. There's no F tier units actually for Gondor that I would sort of perceive in the same way that the Norretino Cavalry are for Imladris. Imladris overall I think had maybe a slightly higher percentage of their units in the A and S tier. They only had one S tier unit. Going back, I might have raised the Imladris Guardians to be one step higher. If we consider that, I think Gondor overall have got sort of more consistently sort of around the B tier, but I think that's kind of what you'd expect as well. Like Imladris, sort of higher end units, some of their better units, obviously sort of higher population up there, but Gondor overall maintain a little bit more consistency throughout their entire roster, which I think is about right when you think about it like that. So yeah, that would be my thoughts on Gondor. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'm sure there'll be some people disagreeing with me. I think the Wardens of the White Tower and the Peneth Galen Cavalry down in C might be the two maybe more controversial picks. Maybe the Vets of Osgiliath as well in B. Maybe some people think they should be a little bit higher. Maybe the Axemen of Lasarnak, people might think drop that down to B tier. But do let me know what you think. I mean, again, these tier lists, it's worth saying, are subjective. It's my opinion. Like, it's not mathematically the correct thing. To try and mathematically prove most of these things would take quite a long time, I'm sure. But yeah, those are my thoughts on Gondor. Obviously, this is going to be a series which sort of slowly chugs along over time. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you found it somewhat informative. And I hope you will join me for whatever is next.